And again, the children are leaving for godly play during worship, not because we've made any big decisions about worship timing, but because of today's topic. And we're doing it today because it was the only day that worked, frankly. But why are we talking about reproductive justice today? Why are we talking about abortion? It's because if you've, of course, been paying attention to the news, it's anticipated that the Supreme Court is going to overturn Roe versus Wade sometime this summer, making it possible for states to make abortion illegal. And many states have already announced that they are going to do just that. So it's a good time to look at what our faith, what our tradition, what our Bible says about reproductive justice and about abortion. So I want to look really quickly as background before we hear anything from the Bible about 4 texts. There are 2 references commonly used by Christians who are adamantly opposed to abortion. The first is Psalm 139, and you've heard Psalm 139. It's one of my favorites. It is, of course, poetry. It's metaphorical language used to describe God's very intimate nearness to us. You remember how it starts out, Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. And it goes on in that vein. Verse 13 and 14 read, it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Similarly, Jeremiah uses metaphorical language to describe God when God called him to be a prophet. It says, now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Now, how do you know that that language is metaphorical rather than straightforward? It's because when Jeremiah goes on to protest that he's too young, he doesn't know how to speak, God assures him. And then we hear this. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, now I have put my words in your mouth. That's metaphor. It's beautiful. It's poetry, but it's metaphor. It's powerful and moving, but it's not literal. Now, consider that there are 2 places in the Bible that do directly address abortion, kind of. The first is found in Exodus 21, and it comes right after Moses delivers the 10 Commandments, and then he begins to expound on the details. Exodus 21, 22 to 25 describes a situation in which a pregnant woman intervenes in a fight between 2 men. And in intervening, she gets roughed up and she suffers a miscarriage. The 2 men are fined. They're fined, but had they been considered to have taken a life, they would have been put to death, as is detailed very clearly in Genesis 9 and Exodus 21:12. If, however, the woman in intervening between them had died, then the men would have committed murder and they would have paid with their lives. So they're fined for causing a miscarriage. They're put to death for taking her life. And from that, the rabbis, down through the ages, have concluded that the life of a pregnant woman is more valuable than the life of a fetus. That comes from their reading of Exodus 21. The other Bible reference we're not going to read, you can go home and read it if you'd like. It's a really strange one found in Numbers 5. It offers up the only instance of trial by ordeal in the Bible. A husband who is suspicious of his wife's faithfulness could take her to the priest, who would force her to drink an abortifacient, the results of which would determine her guilt or her innocence. That's one of those texts that just makes you go, ew. No need to dwell on that one, except perhaps noticing that should she somehow be shown to be innocent, no harm, no foul on her accusing husband. Just saying. Now, the story from Mark we're going to hear doesn't directly relate, but it is a lovely story of reproductive justice. Jesus is on his way to heal the daughter of a very important man, one of the leaders of the local synagogue. A large crowd follows, presses in on Jesus. Suddenly, though, he feels a disturbance in the force. Healing energy has gone out of him. A woman desperate for healing had reached out and touched his cloak. Now, this woman had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. The important thing to know about that is that, awful as it was to go through that for 12 years and that no one had been able to help her, because of her continual bleeding, the woman would have been regarded in Jewish law as a menstruating woman and therefore ritually unclean that entire time. Because of the constant bleeding, she lived in a constant state of uncleanliness, which would have brought her social and religious isolation. It would have prevented her from getting married. Or if she was already married, it would have prevented her from having children or even having sexual relations with her husband, and it could have been cited by him as grounds for divorce. No wonder she was so desperate she reached out just to touch Jesus' cloak. Now, touching Jesus should have made him unclean. Instead, the touch made the woman clean. Then my favorite part. He not only healed her physically, but he claimed this isolated woman as his own. He said to her daughter, he called her daughter, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." He restored her health and he restored her to her community after 12 long years of utter isolation. Now, we're going to be talking about reproductive justice, specifically about abortion. I suspect we're of many minds about this. So I invite you to listen attentively and wholeheartedly as Dawn reads the scriptures, and then to reflect lovingly as the remnant of the choir sings Y Solos Digo, reminding us that wherever two or three are gathered, we're in there, that God is in our midst. Probably appropriate for the choir today. I think there's only 3 or 4 of them, as they've been hit hard by people ill with COVID and other things. Don?
Thank you. Reading first from Exodus. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. Now reading the words of Mark. And a large crowd followed Jesus and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that time she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
We're going to run a little long today. This is not going to be a 45-minute service, but the children need more time in godly play anyway. Let's pray. Beloved God, as always, I pray that you will open our ears, our hearts, our eyes, our imaginations to hear your word for our lives today. And bless us as we contemplate together with love and grace and compassion for one another and for the world. Amen. I realized that I have never preached on reproductive justice. How can that be? I have been preaching for a long time now. I think part of the reason is that legalized abortion seemed to be the settled law of the land after the Supreme Court ruled on Roe v. Wade 50 years ago. Now it looks as though the court will overturn Roe v. Wade sometime this summer, and very quickly abortion at any stage will be illegal in a great number of states. Now I know this is a very odd thing to preach on Father's Day. It was the one day we could do it, and I don't know whether to apologize or to say, well, it makes perfect sense. Because when we talk about reproductive justice, we can't talk about that without talking about men too, correct? As I understand biology, and I do have a teaching minor in biology, though it's from a long time ago. Now, today's sermon is certainly not the final word on the subject, nor the whole word. And to continue the discussion, I invite you to join me next Sunday in the adult ed time after worship, along with the Reverend Dr. Pat Ross, next week in the Niebuhr room to continue the conversation. Pat and Jean, too, have put much more thought and time into this topic than I have. And believe me, many a time this week, I wished that I had just asked them to preach today. But they blessed me with a great many materials, and I'm grateful for that. What I want to tell you first off is that I have journeyed a long way on this issue over the course of my life. I grew up in a United Church of Christ, but we never talked about these things in church. No, our whole lives, sexuality curriculum in Dayton, Washington. Somehow, though, and it was probably more of a family thing than it was a church thing, I understood that the worst possible sin of all sins was to get pregnant before marriage. Guaranteed exile. Guaranteed. One year, and I was pretty young, I had horrific recurring nightmares about being pregnant all year long. Understand, I didn't know how a person became pregnant, which actually made the nightmares all the worse. Once I learned that piece of vital information, the nightmares began to go away. But for some reason, I adopted my family's rigidity on the topic. Don't even think about having sex with somebody if you are not prepared to raise a child together or to give up the child for adoption. Oh, there was so much I didn't understand, and I was so sure I knew it all. Probably not the only 18-year-old in the world like that. I didn't understand how falling in love can just make you crazy. How falling in love makes your brains drop out of your head for about a year. I think it's nature's tricky biological plan to populate the planet. I didn't understand how contraception can fail. Even the most practiced practitioners of contraception can have contraception fail. In a year of typical use, the failure rate for condoms is 15%. The sponge, 15 to 35%. The pill even is 8%. I didn't understand the prevalence of date rape. Now studies vary, as do definitions of it, but it looks like 15 to 20% of women have experienced date rape at some point in their lives. Look around the room and think to yourself, 15 to 20%. I didn't understand economics. I grew up in a tidy little middle-class home. I thought that anybody that worked hard could have enough. 3/4 of women who seek abortion say they cannot afford to raise a child, or raise another child, more likely. My easy, breezy stance of continue the pregnancy to term and give the child up for adoption, I had no idea about the demands of pregnancy. I had no idea of the rigors and risks of giving birth. I had no idea of the tremendous sacrificial love involved in giving up a child for adoption. And I remain in awe of those of you who have done just that. Beyond that, over time, I watched friends who had chosen to have abortions later go on to have healthy families that would never have happened had they carried the early pregnancy to full term. And I had to scratch my head and think long and hard about that. And also, over time, I got it through my thick head that this is about much more than abortions. This is about reproductive justice. It's about the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy. It's about the right to have children or to not have children. And it's about the human right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. That it's not only about choice, it's about access. That even when abortion and contraception are legal, many people can't afford it or can't afford to travel hundreds of miles to the nearest clinic. There's no choice when there's no access. It's also about accessing comprehensive sex education, prenatal and pregnancy care, adequate wages to ensure that families can purchase healthy food, have a roof over their head, and a safe neighborhood. And most of all these days, I've come to wonder why it is that among the Christians who claim to be pro-life, very few of them are pro-all of life. Seems to me if you claim the mantle pro-life, shouldn't you equally care about whether a child has adequate nutrition, secure housing, a safe neighborhood, get to be raised by parents, or a parent guaranteed adequate family leave and insurance to care for you when you're sick? If you're pro-life, shouldn't you be for greater gun safety? If you're pro-life, shouldn't you be anti-war? If you're pro-life, shouldn't you be opposed to the death penalty? And if you're pro-life, shouldn't you be agitating for all of the things that slow or reverse climate change and guarantee a healthy future for generations of children yet to be born? What I just described is called the seamless garment, or used to be called the seamless garment pro-life ethic. Though now, when I read about the seamless garment, I read about it in a different note. Now, when they talk about it, they're talking about favoring innocent life. And what can be more innocent than an unborn life? But a baby once born gets complicated very fast. A baby once born can soon become a burden that means your employee needs time off to care for them. That baby can grow up to become your bratty nephew. That neighbor can become that baby can become your intrusive neighbor, right? The teenage graffiti artist. The baby grows up to become the homeless person camped out on the sidewalk in front of your gym. The Al-Qaeda militant, the Russian soldier, the felon on death row. Babies grow up to be very complicated people. No wonder there's an emphasis on this lovely prenatal life that is so innocent, because they're so easy to love and there's no complicated, messy human relationship involved. Joan Chittister, a Catholic nun, says, "I think in many cases your morality is deeply lacking if all you want is a child born but not a child fed, not a child educated, not a child housed. That's not pro-life, that's pro-birth." It's also curious to me that pro-life Christians equate abortion with murder with no qualification whatsoever. Abortion murder. Yet there's all kinds of qualifications about other kinds of homicide. Have you noticed that? The late Christian ethicist Beverly Wildung Harrison pointed out that the Christian just war tradition has legitimated widespread forms of killing in war. And Christian ethicists have extended great latitude to those in power to make choices about killing human beings in all kinds of ways. Those in power daily make life-determining decisions about nuclear power, about chemical use in the environment that affects the well-being of fetuses. Harrison says, would that such moralists would extend equal benefit of a doubt to any woman facing life-crushing psychological and political economic resources to support her childbearing. But they don't. All right, having said all that, I still sympathize with those who deeply believe that abortion at any stage is the taking of a life and should be illegal. I once believed that. For 2 or 3 years in my late teens and early 20s, I lived in a land of lovely clarity, thinking I knew the absolute living dividing line between right and wrong, good and bad, Christian and non-Christian. I still know people who live in what they believe is the absolute clarity of the moral high ground. And sometimes I envy the easy power of their convictions. But I know now that life is so much more complex than that. I wish there were a better way to express it, but the best language I have is that I once lived in a land of black and white thinking, though the world is actually filled with subtle shades of gray. In the land of black and white thinking, I thought that those who are anti-abortion spoke for all people of faith and for all Christians, and they don't. Not even close. Did you know that most of the Jewish faithful support a woman's right to choose? And because of Exodus 21, hold that a woman's life is of much more value than a fetus. They believe that a fetus is not a full person until the head emerges in the birthing process and breathes its first breath. Then it becomes a living soul. Historically, the Roman Catholics believed in something called ensoulment. The soul entered the fetus at a certain stage, and then it became a living being. And usually that happened around the stage of quickening, when fetal movement began, which is how many months? All of those, about 5, 4 or 5, okay. And since there was poor understanding of embryology until the last 50 years or so, this date of ensoulment moved around, sometimes for clerical convenience. I took medical ethics in seminary from a Jesuit priest, and I can tell you a story or two about that next week. Here's a paragraph from Wildung Harrison's essay that captures it well. She said, "The Holy Crusade of present teaching on abortion is quite new in Christianity and is related to cultural shifts that are requiring the Christian tradition to choose sides in this present ideological struggle. No Protestant clergy or theologian gave early support for proposed 19th century laws banning abortion in the United States. It is my impression," she writes, "that Protestant clergy, usually married and often poor, were aware that romanticizing nature's bounty with respect to procreation resulted in a great deal of human suffering." Well, just this last June 2nd, a group of faith leaders met at the White House to highlight the importance of the constitutional rights affirmed in Roe v. Wade, including the fundamental right to privacy. Participants underscored the importance of assuring that health care decisions are made by women without the interference of politicians. They also cited fears about challenges facing families and their congregations and communities as states pass extreme laws restricting access to reproductive health care. Attending that meeting were 4 major Jewish denominations and 5 Protestant denominations, big ones. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, that's the mainline Lutherans, they were there. The United Methodist Church was there. The Presbyterian Church of the USA was there. And of course, the United Church of Christ. Our own General Minister and President John Dorauer noted that there's a collective anger and frustration and disdain in this belief that all religions oppose abortions. The vast majority of religious members support safe, affordable, accessible abortions. To that, I would add the words legal and rare. Way back in 1971, a year before Roe v. Wade was made the settled law of the land, the UCC General Synod passed a resolution saying that a responsible position concerning abortion should be based on a consideration of the rights of the individual woman, her potential child, her family, and society, as well as the rights of the fetus. Writing 1 year before that watershed ruling, our church said, "We believe that present laws prohibiting abortion are neither just nor enforceable." And at least 6 more resolutions in similar veins followed over the years. The working bottom line of the United Church of Christ on this is that reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal autonomy, have children, not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. You know, back in the land of black and white thinking, I was sure that life began at conception. Then I started taking a lot of biology classes and learned that conception itself is a complex, multi-stage process that goes on for days, if not longer. In the land of black and white thinking, I thought that criminalizing abortion would reduce the number of abortions. Statistics over and over in the United States and on the world stage show that that is not true. And in fact, when we have administrations that pass these global gag laws that say we won't give money to overseas nonprofits that provide reproductive health care, including abortion, when we defund those groups, abortion rates in those countries go up about 40%. 40%. In the land of black and white thinking, I thought that to be pro-life was to focus on opposing abortion. But life is so much larger than that. When Jesus healed the hemorrhaging woman, he not only healed her body, but he knew that wasn't enough. He restored her to her full social world. Longtime evangelical turned progressive Episcopalian Rachel Held Evans. I don't know if any of you read Rachel Held Evans. She understood this. She was a mother of 2, a millennial blogger. She wrote this before her untimely death a few years ago. She said that creating a culture of life isn't just about standing in a picket line with a Choose Life sign. It's about seriously addressing the problem of income equality in this country so that no woman has to choose between getting an abortion or raising her child in desperate poverty. It means celebrating motherhood and fatherhood by making America the most generous country in the developed world, rather than the least generous when it comes to maternity and paternity leave. And it means working together on efforts to reduce the cost of food, diapers, childcare, pediatric visits, college tuition, adoptions, resources for special needs children. It means making contraception affordable and accessible. It means creating a culture that can sustainably welcome those babies as they grow into children and adults. In the land of black and white thinking, life was a lot simpler. I debated telling this story. I was, I think, a junior in college, and an old friend came up to me one day at the coffee shop on campus and said, "So what do you think about abortion?" And I laid out what I thought was my Christian obligation to tell her, that life begins at conception and that you shouldn't have sex with anybody unless you're prepared to raise a child with them, on and on and on. She looked a little stricken. And I later realized, the Christian thing would have been to say, "Why are you asking? How can I help? Do you need a ride?" In the land of black and white thinking, life was a lot simpler. Then I emerged into the world of shades of gray and learned life is so much more complex than I dreamed. Loving ourselves and our neighbors is now so much richer and nuanced. It turns out that in the world of shades of gray, there is much more life, and dare I say, even multi-hued rainbows of colors and complexity. It's in that land where we actually live that I hope and pray and work for a culture where reproductive justice keeps abortion not only legal and safe, but accessible and rare, and trusts each woman, each woman's family to make the choice that is best for her family, for her community. And with that, I've said enough. We can talk more next week.